Hi, this is Will.
And this is Tree.
Welcome to the Technium, where we talk about the edge of technology and what we can build with it. An optimistic look at the road ahead. How's it going, Tree?
Pretty good, pretty good. Just coming back from a big camping trip.
That's great. Hopefully it's not just the same beer that you... Hopefully you don't come back with the same beer and say, I got it from the camping trip.
No. I actually brought back some apple cider from the farms of Western Massachusetts. So
off-brand. This channel gets hipster and more hipster, I guess.
Yep.
I am just going down the aisles of Whole Foods buying brands that I don't recognize. So I have a Rowdy Mermaid, Strawberry Holy Basil, a sparkling immunity tonic. I hope this doesn't taste terrible. I don't know, when things are called tonics, I'm not sure how well they'll taste.
Yeah, I'm not really sure what a Rowdy Mermaid is, but
yeah,
that sounds like a good time.
And then a kombucha, the Island Mango, passion fruit ginger green tea. So hopefully that's not too bad as either.
Very nice.
So, are you ready for this week's show?
I am. I hear we're talking about DAOs.
That's right. We're talking about DAOs. And a DAO is a decentralized autonomous organization. And it's a group of people that is organized around a goal or a mission, and they coordinate themselves to collective action. But what's different from, say, a company or a collective, these groups exist solely online, and they coordinate their actions through a shared set of rules that are enforced on a blockchain. And so some of these rules tend to be around governance. So like voting, they would have different proposals of what the DAO should do next. And they vote on things. They have, chat tools to kind of talk about things. But mostly it's the governance tools such as voting that are enforced on chain. So that's what we're talking about today.
Cool. Yeah. Actually, this is the first time in this podcast that we're actually doing a topic about crypto. So I'm really excited about DAOs as our first crypto topic.
Right, because you've been flirting with crypto ever since our very first episode, I guess. So yeah. Here we go.
So for once, I don't have to shoehorn it into an unrelated topic.
Even though, like, outside of these things, you never ever talk about crypto, but somehow it's just inside these episodes. You're like, oh, yeah, I need me some crypto.
Yeah, and one of the reasons why I've been getting increasingly hyped about crypto are DAOs. DAOs are really analogous to these organizations that we have offline in real life. Things like corporations, nonprofits, and other decision-making bodies. For example, even local governments, city councils, things like that. But the interesting thing about DAOs is that all of the governance, the voting, the rules by which it operates, the way that it can access its assets are codified on the blockchain. So it has a set of rules which are basically irrevocable. So, or they can be updated, but for the most part, the way that it operates cannot really be circumvented. So it gives some sort of guarantees about the way it operates. And it's not really tied to a particular jurisdiction. So I think that if you think about a corporation, it's incorporated in a certain place, and the way that it operates is governed by the rules of that jurisdiction, and the way that it operates is also enforced by not through any technical means, but through legal means. So the government says that a corporation works this way, and if it doesn't run that way, your only recourse is to sue them in the courts. Whereas in a DAO, it sort of runs the way that it's set up, and you have guarantees around that, and it's not tied to kind of a particular legal jurisdiction.
Yeah, and so one of the things that you mentioned just now was that the rules of governance and basically the rules of how groups of people work together is enforced by law before, right? Instead of on chain. But like, what's wrong with like things being enforced by law? Why would DAOs want to be enforced on chain rather than using good old law?
Yeah, I think that there's a certain level of transparency. Basically, the way that it operates is available for everyone to inspect, and to a degree also available for everyone to participate. And if you compare that to a corporation is a closed system. If you, for example, don't trust the way that it runs, first of all, you actually don't get any transparency into how a given corporation, well, let's say a nonprofit runs. Let's say that you donate money to a nonprofit. You don't know how it's really going to spend those funds. They might put out an investor statement. They might put out some type of transparency report, but there are no contractual sort of guarantees. If you suspect that they're not doing something properly, then you might have some recourse through the legal system, but it's a fairly expensive process and it doesn't really lend itself to transparency at its core. And I think that with a DAO, you get all of that for free, and you get a lot of guarantees. You know that if you give your money to a DAO or you invest in a DAO, that it will operate by the rules by it says, just by definition.
Yeah, I mean, the transparency of a DAO comes from the properties of the underlying blockchain itself, right? And so that's pretty great because, like you said, having up-to-date reporting of where a nonprofit is spending their money is just so onerous that like you might as well just burn all the money on overhead generating these sort of reports. But with a DAO, like you get that part for free. A lot of these DAOs, they used to build their own tools, but various types of startups and organizations have started providing tools for running a DAO so that you don't have to get your hands messy writing smart contracts or anything like that. You, as long as you have a wallet, you can sign up and just start running one or participating in it as an individual inside of the DAO.
Yeah, I want to take a step back and kind of give some examples of the types of organizations that we're talking about. So I came up with a short list, but basically we're talking about organizations that have a common goal, and they have a group of people. I like to think of them as different types of stakeholders who are trying to advance that goal. So we gave the example of a corporation or a nonprofit. A lot of the DAOs that we've seen are centered around the running and management of a crypto project or a type of infrastructure. So the stakeholders are either the developers or the users of that project, and their goal is to kind of keep the project functioning, to add new features, to make sure that the project is stable and growing. And so that's one class of DAOs that I've seen.
Yeah, like a lot of the different projects that like DeFi projects or even the NFT projects, they'll use the NFTs or the tokens as a signifier for membership. And then you can use either the tokens or the NFTs as part of the votes that you have and a way to participate inside of the DAO.
Yeah, and everybody in that project has a vested interest in making sure that the DAO is advancing the mission of whatever goal. A lot of the time it's through the fact that they have invested their resources to acquire those tokens or the NFTs to demonstrate their sort of commitment that they have skin in the game.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Yeah. And it's another building block in which you can build communities. But that's kind of an overloaded term nowadays. Everybody wants to build communities, but it's just another way of organizing people. In the same way that when the group buying came out, like Groupon, it was just another way of organizing a collective action to get a discount. And for Kickstarter and Indiegogo, it expanded the scope a little bit more so that you can have different targeted goals. But there, it's a centralized entity that can reject different goals or groups that want to get together. Whereas with DAOs, it's completely unstoppable. Anybody can set up different DAOs for different goals and different missions, and come to consensus for collective action through the governance tools that you have on chain.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting part that cannot be overlooked, is that it's not reliant on any central entity. So something that came to mind is that, if you remember Star Wars, you had the Rebel Alliance, and obviously there would probably be a lot of incentive for the Empire to stamp out the Rebel Alliance from any type of communication platforms or whatever they had going on in Star Wars. But they could run a DAO and maybe organize their attack on the Death Star.
Right, we got to raise more money for some more X-Wings. So if anybody in the galaxy wants to contribute,
yeah, exactly.
That's the case. Yeah, I mean, like it's not so far-fetched, because like Kickstarter had rules as to like what sort of projects could create different Kickstarter campaigns on their platform, right? Because I forgot, is it products, I guess, or like maybe at one point it was like venture funded web products or something like that they didn't want on there, but anyways, they do have a system there, so it's not beyond the realm of possibility. It's not just us hand waving saying, oh, this might happen. Like people already do curate this sort of stuff.
So we've talked about DAOs that run crypto projects and keep them running. What are some DAOs that exist today that are working on this?
Yeah, there are a couple. For a while, DAOs fell out of favor because the very first DAO that existed on Ethereum came online, raised a whole bunch of money, a couple $1 million, and then there was a hack due to the weakness in the smart contract that siphoned off about a third of its funds. So DAOs fell out of favor for a couple of years before they came back again. And so now we have a variety of different DAOs that do a variety of different things. One of the older DAOs that is still in existence today is MakerDAO, and they're a decentralized organization built on Ethereum to allow lending and borrowing of cryptocurrencies without the need of a middleman like a bank. And in order to borrow on the blockchain, there's no credit, so you have to over collateralize. Nowadays, as an aside, people have figured out like other ways to do this without over collateralizing, but that could be for a different episode. But the point here is that through the mechanism of lending and borrowing involving 3 different cryptocurrencies, ETH, Maker, and DAI, they're able to generate a stable coin called DAI, where the value of that coin is always at $1. And then with Maker, that's used as a governance token to decide on what the interest rate for the borrowing is. So people that are holders of the Maker token can collectively vote on whether to increase or decrease the interest rate to help regulate the price of DAI so that it stays at a stable $1. And so that's a pretty interesting system there.
Yeah, I was going to say that a lot of finance relies on central entities. And this almost sounds to me like the Fed here in the US setting interest rates in order to control the rate of growth of the economy or inflation or deflation. And that's a central body, which actually was a controversial decision in the founding of this country.
Mhm.
And so it's interesting to hear about the MakerDAO actually maybe serving an analogous function to this economy and the stability of this currency, DAI.
Mhm.
And I think the advantage I see is that unlike a central body that governs it, this is sort of transparent and also open in that I think you can purchase Maker tokens
Yeah, you
and
can.
participate in it.
Right. And so that's one of the older DAIs that have been around 2017 or so, 16, 17. So only 3 or 4 years of one of the older ones. But then there are other ones such as the Moloch DAO, and Moloch DAO is more of an investment vehicle. And currently it doesn't really have a lot of activity, but it's spawned and superseded by a lot of other DAOs such as Meta Cartel and the LAO, in which they fund Ethereum like infrastructure projects. And so that's something that people have really taken to, where it's a way to fund infrastructure projects. There are other types of DAOs that are investment vehicles, such as the Yield Guild, and they invest in digital real estate inside of games as NFTs. And so they collective buy these NFTs to acquire rare and valuable NFTs that represent various in-game assets, from real estate to armor or items. And there are people that are in the Philippines in the pandemic that couldn't work, and they turned to Yield Guild to have an income stream. And so you'll see them playing on phones and stuff like that as part of their work, to people that you wouldn't think of traditionally as gamers. But yeah, like that's something that's happening today.
Wow.
And then lastly, there's something relatively recent, Party DAO by John C. Palmer and his team. Like, he's also a guy from YC, and it's a DAO in which their purpose is to buy NFTs collectively, because a lot of NFTs today have a floor price that is high, to say the least. Like some of the floor prices are like 10 ETH, which at the time of this podcast is like what, $30,000, right?
Yeah.
Thereabouts. And so it's out of like most people are priced out of it. And so what Party DAOs allows people to do is fractionalize these NFTs so that it's a collective group buying DAO for NFTs, and they share in the ownership of that. And so there's a lot of different things that people are doing. And that's not to mention like a lot of the DeFi projects such as Uniswap, Aave, AAVE, and Aave, okay, and SushiSwap, and so on and so forth. ENS, like these are all DAOs to one degree or another, where they have voting members with proposals to say, hey, this is where I think we should go, and stuff like that.
Very cool. So DAOs are real. They're not just kind of theoretical idea. They're being used to actually run these projects, it seems.
Yeah, they're being run. They're being used and run today, and for some of the bigger ones, it seems rather effectively, because for example, the price of DAI has stuck around to $1 so far, even though the volatility of ETH may have had the chance to affect it. They've held relatively steady.
Nice, very cool.
So beyond like people that are supporting crypto projects, like what are the other DAO types that you've seen?
Yeah, I've seen a lot of DAOs that represent a particular interest group that doesn't necessarily have to do with a concrete crypto project. So I've seen DAOs that are trying to create grants for artists. And so they sort of pool together their resources and decide that they're going to invest in a particular artist or project or endeavor, and they sort of give these micro grants. And so the way that DAOs help is that whoever are the sort of partners of this grant DAO vote on who they're going to disperse their funds to. So that's kind of an interesting one. I've also seen DAOs organized around just social groups as well. So I think there's an interesting project called Friends with Benefits, which is a sort of invite-only community of crypto intellectuals, and they basically require that you own a certain token or actually a certain amount of tokens to join their community. And then once you're a member, you're also a voting member of their DAO. And so you can decide how that community runs.
Yeah, I think it's been interesting where open source projects had often had difficulty finding funding for the important work that they do in writing software that holds up a lot of the infrastructure for the internet. I'm surprised that it even works at all, honestly.
Yeah.
Like there's like, it's smaller than you would think. Like it's just a handful, maybe 2 or 3 people that are like working on infrastructure software. But the interesting thing about the infrastructure for Ethereum was that Ethereum was effectively about money. And so they could take the product that they have and turn it back on itself to invest in even more infrastructure. So in that way, they were able to kind of bootstrap and support developers working on improving the network. And so initially a lot of the investment funds that I saw were Ethereum like infrastructure funds, but now I think they've kind of branched out where there's a lot more investment funds where the members are in it mainly to get a yield of whether it's investing in NFTs or in certain tokens or so on and so forth. And then on the flip side, there are some DAOs that I've seen that try to tie to real world things to affect environment. So environmentally conscious DAOs and whatnot. And so we can get into that later, but it's just something that I've seen in terms of investment funds and whatnot.
Yeah, definitely. And actually the open source point is really interesting because I think on Hacker News, I've seen a lot of posts, maybe once every couple of months, where it's a open source maintainer who's burnt out and they're like, I give up on this project. And it turns out nobody's getting paid anything. And I think there's a lot of ambiguity when you're running an open source project around the decision making. And a lot of that inevitably informally falls upon the main contributor. And so I think a DAO is a great way to alleviate that pressure and make sure that there's continuity, both financially as well as, I think, psychologically, making sure that critical infrastructure of the internet going forward is kind of built in a sustainable way.
Yeah, and there is a project like Gitcoin that is trying to fund the open web, not all projects together, but like there are people that are starting DAOs that are trying to help fix this problem, but definitely it's not a pervasive solution to the open source funding problem that we have yet. But yeah, I mean, like this it's interesting for these kinds of reasons, right? Where you can get people to do stuff together. That's where like humans have been able to scale from like a small tribe of people to like companies, organizations, cities, and nation states.
Yeah, so there's an interesting project out in Wyoming, which is basically starting a commune. I think they have several acres of land, maybe more. And they're calling it a city, but it's effectively a commune. And they're using this DAO to decide things about how they're going to develop the land, what kind of physical infrastructure they're going to invest in. And if you're an investor in this DAO, you have voting rights. And so it's an interesting kind of connect between a completely digital organization powered by these digital structures and then actual physical land. And I think the key point that allows this bridge between online and offline is the fact that the Wyoming legislature has recognized a DAO as an official type of entity. And so I think that will make it an interesting place to develop this kind of new government structures.
Yeah, I was surprised that it was in Wyoming, but I think it makes sense given that I think it was the senator of Wyoming, Cynthia Lummis, that has been really been behind some of these legislative advancements within her state. It's kind of like, I imagine in the same way that Delaware has a lot of corporations that are incorporated in that state, mostly because A, everybody's used to doing it, but B, there are advantages for C Corps to be incorporated there. And so in the same way, I think Wyoming is getting the jump on it so that DAOs would, quote unquote, incorporate in the state of Wyoming, giving the state an advantage for these sort of things. Because as more and more of our lives are online, the geographic constraints don't really hem in a geographic area anymore. So if Wyoming can get a jump on being friendly to DAOs and they make it big, then it's probably going to be a big boon to the state.
Yeah, I was also thinking, connecting back to this metaverse concept that we were discussing, there is this aspect of the metaverse that is online and offline merging. And it makes sense that going forward, if we want that to happen, then we need a way to connect the decision-making power of DAOs to be able to affect change in the real world, including being able to do things like own physical property or sign a contract with a corporation who's not a DAO, right? And so I think there's going to be a lot of case law that is inevitably going to be developed, but also a lot of new laws and that are going to be passed in legislative bodies that recognize a DAO and the interface between a DAO and your traditional contract law.
Yeah. So I think this will be exciting. Not the actual tools are not nearly as sexy as the other things that we've talked about, but I think anytime that you can get a whole bunch of people together to do stuff, you're going to change the world in some significant way. And I see DAOs as not going away anytime soon. And we're going to see evidence of this across different aspects of our lives in the near future.
Yeah, I'm curious to hear, we've gone into the kind of concrete examples of what are DAOs and how they're sort of powered differently than your traditional groups. What do you think it enables us to do that we wouldn't be able to do before? I think we talked about transparency, but are there other interesting aspects to this?
I guess the thing that came to mind was a sense of ownership of these DAOs, because the governing tools is based on the ownership of rare and limited tokens and NFTs. I think a lot of Americans feel like the country may be doing well, but they don't feel like they're improving along with it. And I think part of the issue there is that there's no sense of equity in the rising wealth of America doing well, and most of the wealth is in equity of a variety of different companies. And while people in the social economic stratus that like you and I know, like we invest in stocks, there's plenty of people that I've met where they felt like stocks are a little too abstract. And they'd rather invest in something concrete like real estate. But then surprisingly, like these very same people are like, oh yeah, crypto, no problem. So my point is that the new thing that DAOs allow us to do is, if you are a user of the web and of cryptocurrency wallets, then you can participate in the ownership of various organizations that can increase in value, and your own assets and worth, financial worth, would increase with the increased value of these DAOs.
Yeah, I think that that's a really key point, that DAOs open access in a couple senses. Obviously, not all DAOs are going to allow everybody to just join off the street and make big decisions for an important project. But it's open access in the sense that right now, the only way that you can participate in the running of what are now core parts of infrastructure, people are calling Facebook and Google, for example, core infrastructure that we all depend upon today. There's a separation between the users of that infrastructure or those services and the people who run it and decide how those things run. And part of that is due to the financial and legal mechanisms by which they were founded. So in a corporation, and these are, I guess, C corps, you have shareholders, and that's a separate class of people than the users. And so if you want to have ownership and some sway in the way that these companies run, you buy shares and presumably get to vote, although that's getting harder and harder these days. But I think the interesting thing about DAOs is that you can basically open up decision making to all different types of stakeholders. So you can decide that if your DAO is growing, you allow the users of your project to also have some say in the direction of the project, and maybe vote on features that they want, or key decisions that will affect them in a way that you wouldn't really be able to do in any enforceable manner in a traditional legally incorporated corporation.
Yeah, and that's why it made such a big splash that like activist investors managed to get like climate supporters onto, was it ExxonMobil's board, right? Yeah. And so we have just companies that are mind-boggling big. Like even I have a hard sense, like getting a sense of like what a $1 trillion company looks like, but I think we have a couple by now, right? So yeah. So but like it's so pervasive and so useful that it feels like it should be a utility. But like the way that these corporations are structured is that if you can get to that place, there's no really upper limit. There's no like phase transition for these companies to turn into utilities, which would be better for the public. It doesn't become a public good or anything like that, because the assumption is that like if you built these things, you should reap the benefits, and as far as you can go, as high as you can go, the bigger the better sort of thing. Of course, that's not strictly true, because we have monopoly laws that were enacted like back in the late 1800s on the oil industry. And so there has been some action, but nowadays I think the definition of monopoly has slightly changed, and lawmakers are having a hard time coming to terms with those to figure out exactly what it is, because it doesn't quite fit the standard definition. And so DAOs are a way to kind of start from the bottom up again as a collective good.
Yeah. And it's not only sort of the greed aspect. I think that there's just logistical.
Yeah, I didn't mean to say that this is greed. It's just the way that uh, our corporations are structured, and it's just nobody expected these things to get as big as they are, and usually that happens when there's like a step function in the platforms and the technologies that are available at the time, right? So
yeah, exactly. Yeah, and, I think, imagine if you have a utility, imagine if you turn Facebook into a utility and you say that all users of Facebook get some amount of sway, some amount of voting power in the running of Facebook. Well, Facebook has now several billion users. There's no way that the legal system would be able to handle resolving a vote or a conflict of any kind among so many different parties. But presumably that could happen with a DAO, although I'm not sure if there are scaling limits to the blockchain if you have a 3 billion user DAO, but we'll solve that problem down the line.
I think in terms of scale, I think I have reasonable confidence that as more people turn onto DAOs, we'll kind of figure out some of these scaling problems. But there probably are limitations of some sort, whether they're technical or like social cultural, to these DAOs that we haven't quite figured out yet. I guess like when it comes to the DAOs, because a certain part of the governance is on chain, it does lower the friction for the processes that are in place that has to interact with government bodies, like local government bodies. I have a friend that does interior design, and just getting permits for some of the stuff to redo places, that can take a while. And so in the same way, like getting a vote to act on a certain proposal in a DAO is all on chain. And so in a DAO, that can go a lot faster. You don't need to involve the structures that are in place in the law for things like that.
Yeah, and I think that people are looking into ways that DAOs can also run without constantly having to vote or poll the members to vote. Mm-hmm. So definitely you can structure DAOs in any decision-making way that you wish. You can delegate decisions to certain people or to certain groups, or to a founding person or benevolent dictator for life, presumably. Mm-hmm. It's all up to you kind of how you want to structure it, and presumably everyone will agree upon that as a fair structure for the running of the project.
Yeah, one of the interesting things about having 1,000 DAOs bloom is that you get a lot of different governance structures with a lot of these different projects. And so one of the interesting things about having state governments deciding certain things for themselves is you get little pockets of experiments where different states can see what works, what doesn't, right? And then the ones that are successful, other states can copy it or take a version of that and apply it to their own state. But we only have 50 states to run these sort of experiments on. And so with the DAO, you can experiment with a lot of different types of governing and voting schemes. Like people have talked about quadratic voting and weighted voting, or what is a stacked ranking or something like that. And so, right, it's really hard to get these sort of ideas implemented in traditional organizations that, or like in state governance that tries these things out. But with DAOs, you can just try it out, see what sort of unintended side effects there are to these different rules that you have, and hopefully we can take the best of that and replicate it across different DAOs, and perhaps maybe eventually like our own state and federal legislature for specific things.
Yeah, or maybe we'll replace our state and federal legislatures with DAOs
With
themselves.
DAOs themselves. And that may be a scary thing that like governments may not like. And so I guess we'll see. But yeah.
Yeah. I'm really interested in the interface between DAOs and traditional decision-making bodies, whether they are governments or traditional corporations. And something that comes to mind is that Wall Street Bets, the subreddit, was able to meaningfully move the stock price of AMC and a few other meme stocks. And so you can imagine that there could be a Wall Street Bets DAO, which actually pools their money together and actually takes a significant ownership of a traditional corporation. And then what happens then, right? Like that is going to be such a weird world.
It is a weird world because like nowadays people are driven by memes too. And so you're going to get like completely irrational DAOs that just, I don't know, they're like chaos monkeys running around, like just doing it for the lulz. And I can see some odd stuff happening, and I'm not sure whether that's like a net good or a net bad.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I think there's going to just be pure chaos for a while. And like you alluded to, I think that the traditional power structures are going to start to get cagey about their sort of monopoly on power erode, I suppose. So, if, for example, this Wyoming commune, it actually starts taking off and starts running in a way, I think that maybe other city governments or other traditional politicians might look at that and start to feel like the system in which they have built their careers is sort of eroding, or this is undermining those values. And there might be a lot of regulation or a lot of outrage around these DAOs. Similar with the financial industry, I think if there are DAOs that start to do chaotic things and cause big movements in the markets, the traditional financial firms and the SEC and all of those entities are going to start to look more closely into DAOs and start to sort of push back against it, and it'll be an interesting world.
Yeah, I can see that. And we've been talking a lot about DAOs in terms of governance in our society, but you could have governance at a variety of different levels, from like your local HOA all the way up to whatever, the school board, or even like for certain products, right? Like a lot of the organizations that we use to run the services and products in our lives take the form of a company, but they could presumably also be DAOs as well. And so given that sort of scope, like what are some of the second and third order effects that you can like see from like our limited vantage point here in 2021?
Yeah, I think that you alluded to it through this sort of chaos monkeys comment, but the way that I think DAOs are going to start to have these higher order effects is that they've lowered friction for people to organize themselves. Mm-hmm. So if you think about how much work it takes to actually set up a legal entity like a nonprofit, or incorporate a new town, or incorporate a corporation, It takes a lot of work, and there are some startups now that are reducing that friction. So Stripe Atlas allows you to sort of in a few clicks incorporate an actual legal entity. But if you imagine bringing that friction all the way to zero, you basically can have DAOs that represent decision making at a micro scale. So you can have a group of people, like almost like a gaming guild, kind of get together and spin up a DAO, and then they now have all the full decision making power of any other larger DAO. They can start to actually become voting members of larger DAOs. So that's an interesting thing about DAOs, is that DAOs can be voting members of other DAOs.
Yeah.
And they might, and actually a small gaming guild, depending on who the members are, can actually amass like enough assets to actually do interesting things. Whereas if you have, a group of 10 friends, like it's actually kind of cumbersome to amass assets into a shared bank account and do anything interesting with it.
Yeah, and so there's so many things I wanted to reply to in that comment. It's just rich with side tangents. But one thing I was thinking was maybe I wasn't thinking big enough with like where DAOs could go. Like you could have a DAO down to the individual level where people can buy, I guess, equity in a single person, and then they can vote and dictate on which college you go to, maybe, or like, like I guess there are like a variety of different possibilities for this sort of thing. And so that feels a little bit weird in itself, because at what point does that kind of tip over to like groups of people owning somebody, right? Which we've traditionally like not felt great about. And then the flip side is where you can have virtual influencers run by a DAO. That would be kind of an odd world as well. And so nowadays, there are virtual influencers on Instagram or TikTok in which they're computer generated people that is selling like a lifestyle or a product. And so right now it's like a small team, but you can imagine like a DAO being behind one of those. And then to kind of carry that a little bit further, you could have not just influencers, but politicians or avatar politicians that represent one specific ideology, and then a DAO behind that to kind of push and realize that ideology forward. And in some ways, that also feels a little bit scary as well, because if anybody can start DAOs, you're going to get all sorts of like crazy ass stuff that is running around. And if people are meme driven, then I can see how some of these things that wouldn't work so well in like the ideologies that wouldn't work so well in practice amass a huge following to kind of push things through without really realizing what the side effects or the repercussions are, right? Just looking at Brexit, there are people that voted for it. They're like, I didn't know this would happen. So I don't know.
I think the positive aspect of it is that maybe there's a chance to kind of break this two-party state mentality that we have in the US, right? So there are definitely a lot of different causes that people believe in, which we've sort of created this like umbrella parties. But you can imagine that you can actually splinter those into their individual causes. People care about environment, a certain aspect of the economy, certain
environment for that specific river, or you can break it down, you can cut and dice these DAOs and their missions into a variety of different places, because like if the cost for starting one is so cheap, then people are going to start applying it to all sorts of things. And like you mentioned before, like once you get improvements beyond an order of magnitude, it starts not just being a improvement in quantity, but also an improvement in quality, because you can apply to completely different things that you probably wouldn't have applied it to before, right?
Yeah, definitely. And the interesting thing about having such a variety of DAOs at different levels of scope is that, like you mentioned, you can be affiliated with multiple of them. So in the politics example, you can be affiliated with, something that conserves your local river, something that advocates for, certain privacy rights, let's say, and maybe something that invests in renewable energies or something like that. And so you can have multiple affiliations rather than having one party affiliation. But similarly, the way that right now you sort of work for a single company, it's possible that in the future you actually just work for a fluid set of DAOs depending on your particular skill set and what the demand is for that. And one thing that I've heard a lot in the context of DAOs is that they can create bounties, and they say, we as a DAO, control these assets, and we want this thing to happen. And so we're going to create a bounty, and if you solve this problem for us, then you get the money, or get the tokens, or whatever it is. And so you can imagine that maybe there's a future of work where, rather than saying I'm going to go to the same place every day, you say, okay, I see that there's a nice bounty that I think I can solve. I'm going to go and get that bounty. And then the next month or whatever, you see a different DAO, and then you contribute to that one. And so you don't have this like rigid affiliation anymore.
Yeah, it's kind of like a giant shared group to-do list that you earn money from, right? And so effectively, like inside of organizations like PMs, the product managers or the project managers like organize this sort of stuff, and it gets doled out to different engineers. But here, like it's similar in that sense, but it's collectively organized bounties. And I'm glad you brought that up, because it's one of the things that escaped my mind when you were asking earlier about like what sort of things does this change. And definitely like the nature of work is changing. If you think like just working remote is weird, like working at DAOs in which like you're not tied to any one specific organization will also feel a little bit weird as well. And they can vary in their order of magnitude from like, say, a single local area, single person, up to like the local national level. And it made me wonder, because earlier we glossed over the fact that like DAOs could be members of other DAOs, right? And so you could imagine that the local HOA DAO or like the local school board feeds is also a member of the like the state DAO or something like that, or
yeah,
any number of things. But there's nothing to prevent DAOs from having cycles of dependencies. And so I wonder what sort of conflicts of interest will arise when this sort of thing happens, because like usually we think of organizations as being hierarchical, and it especially governing bodies, because that's kind of how we've organized, and it's a little bit easier for us to wrap our heads around. But DAOs are effectively networked, because DAOs can be members of any other DAO, and there's nothing stopping them. And so if you get cycles, like, and if you're one person is a member of different ones in that cycle, I'm not sure I can work out in my head like what the effects of that will be. And so will it be something where it feels very democratic, but the net effect is that like one person is able to like pull some strings, or because it's so complicated, no one person can really control it, just like no one person controls our market dynamics. And a lot of us is just trying to kind of figure out our local view, try to make the best bet, and then we get to watch everything like pan out in real time. I hope it's the latter, because that's really interesting, right? Because it's not just the DAOs for what we want to do today. Like sometimes I wonder, if there's enough energy on Earth available to keep sending rocket ships like up into space, right? Because at some point you might use up the available energy if you haven't like made the leap to the next technological tech next technology in the tech tree for generating energy, right?
Yeah.
And but another factor besides the energy available is whether we can accumulate enough capital to motivate people to collectively build all this stuff to go into space. Like it'd be awesome if we had a Dyson Sphere DAO.
Yeah.
And
yeah, I think that, the current way of the world, people have been complaining about it, especially in the Silicon Valley. Mark Andreessen and Patrick Carlson and all of these people have this thesis that progress has stalled. Like our institutions right now are so slow moving. They've grown to the point that they have some type of decision-making paralysis, that we can't take on big infrastructure the way that we used to be able to.
Uh-huh.
And so people say that, we built whatever arbitrary infrastructure, the Hoover Dam or something, in like 2 or 3 years, and that would take forever nowadays. And so thinking about big humanity advancing ideas like building a Dyson sphere, or being able to become an interplanetary species, I think that maybe having this alternative decision making model can help us get there faster. And one way that I think it can help us get there faster is based on this idea that DAO membership is fluid and that DAOs can be part of other DAOs. Is that, let's say that you wanted to build a Dyson sphere around the Earth, you actually don't need to incorporate a Dyson Sphere corporation, which is now solely responsible for hiring all the people, interviewing all of them, bringing them on, and structuring it in such a way that this massive infrastructure can happen. You can have a sort of this super DAO that says, we have raised the funds to make this happen. We've collected, the sort of enthusiasm around this project, and here are the problems that we need to solve. And then other DAOs or other individuals can say, hey, I can do something about that, and they can give it a try. And you kind of have this like free market, because if you think about corporations now, it's kind of a command economy. Like even free corporations that compete with each other in the free market internally are organized kind of like communist governments, that the CEO or whatever says, here's the thing that matters to this company, and then all the managers say, okay, to the people below them, okay, here's what matters and here's what you should do. And DAO kind of breaks that by saying, this is our needs, or here's the demand, and then whoever can supply it, and you can get the reward, and you kind of build towards this larger goal.
Are there people inside of DAOs that would be good at breaking down a big task? Because like if plan A is build a Dyson sphere and then C is to profit, you need people in the middle to be able to figure out what the step 2 is, right? And so presumably DAOs won't. I don't know that DAOs solve that problem, but you still need like a variety of different ingredients to do that. But the point that I think you're trying to make is, for organizations in which we used to do collective action, like it's traditionally been onerous to get some of these things in place because the overhead is pretty high, because we just didn't have the tools for coordination, both the communication type of tools and the kind of the governance tools, or the financial and economic tools available to us. But I think with the DAO, we're starting to see some of these variations come online that have different characteristics that don't have as much overhead to get set up. So we should be excited to see like what sort of things these DAOs should be able to accomplish in the world, whether it's in the digital world, financial world, or in the real physical world to move atoms around.
Yeah, definitely. I think one side note, going back to the collective decision making and will DAOs be able to sufficiently break down problems? I think that there's a lot of work that I see going on in the human-centered AI and also the rationality group of people that are focused on how can we break down large problems and fan them out to the crowd and aggregate them and actually come to some consensus about things. And so there's an interesting project called OUGHT.org that's focused on this. So I think that, like you mentioned, which way will these DAOs go? Will we be able to reason about how they work, or will we kind of have mass confusion? I think that DAOs, if they go in the direction that we're thinking, are going to drive demand for a lot of other tools that allow us to break down decision making that was previously kind of been made through closed doors, gut decisions based on the edicts of somebody. The DAOs are going to drive demand for other ways of breaking down problems, maybe in a way that's more evidence-based or more rational, so to speak.
Oh, so then one of the things you touched on, did you mean to say also that you could have DAO members that are bots?
Yeah, I think that we're no strangers to having bots play with humans on this podcast. I think on episode 1 we said that bots can contribute to knowledge graphs and things. Yeah, I see no reason why bots could not contribute to DAOs in some way.
Right. Either as or administrators, like say breaking down the tasks, or be able to do pattern recognition. And so once again, they do some of the grunt work and leave the final voting and governance to the humans, or like they get elevated status in which they get a vote say because they can gather and process a large amount of data. So it's helpful to have both AIs with different algorithms have a weighted vote inside of the DAO organization alongside of the humans that are collectively voting, right?
Yeah, I think that's going to be a really, really weird world.
If it hasn't been already. Because I don't know, excuse me, how many people will kind of accept this kind of world, right?
Yeah. I mean, even I am skeptical, but I think that definitely initially there are lots of minor tasks that an AI can do in a DAO. This is going to be a controversial take. A lot of the function of HR departments in a corporation are basically just making sure that boxes are ticked and that contracts have been signed, the employment agreement has been signed, the when you leave a corporation that you've returned your badge or whatever, right? And these are all just like very automatable processes. And I imagine there's going to be similar types of bookkeeping, maybe not like badging, but some other kind of bookkeeping that happens in a DAO that you can delegate to a bot. And we're riffing on this idea of like AIs being, thinking machines that are making big decisions, but even small things. You could have a small program that is a member of a DAO that serves as basically the HR department of that DAO, make sure that all the things are in order, bookkeeping is done.
Yeah, I think like the different scales that we want to think about this, it leads to a lot of odd scenarios. Like I think it's tempting to think of like AI and DAOs as in the big, but they can also work in the small as well. And that's one of the things that I think that makes technology pretty transformative is the democratization of things that are usually for people that are elite, privileged, or moneyed, right? And so if these sort of tools to create collective action organizations are available not just to governments and state level actors, but to individual groups of people, like what sort of things would come out of it? Yeah, I can see people. Actually, one of the things that I flippantly said that I want to do on my bucket list is to build a loop-de-loop in the middle of the desert in the US, like along the highway. And maybe it just takes a DAO with a whole bunch of memes to get people on board. Like, I don't need to get rich anymore. I can just get people to get on this vision, and they'll fund it. And so, like, I guess there's an option. You don't have to go through the loop de loop if like there's a side ramp, but like, yeah, like you waive all your insurance rights and whatnot if you want to go through it.
Yeah, I think that there are a lot of interesting small projects and small improvements, right? We're talking about DAOs running, massive infrastructure projects, but yeah, there's plenty of things that there's, energy around, interest around. If you think about things like Burning Man, which is kind of a city that spins up and turns down every year, right? It lasts for a week or two, and then it turns down. And Burning Man is sort of a singular example of that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. But because it takes so much energy, actually, Burning Man is a massive endeavor, and they have very, very dedicated people who coordinate with, I think, like the Nevada government and whatever to get all the permits and make all that stuff happen. But imagine if you had thousands of Burning Mans, not literally Burning Mans, but like similar types of ephemeral experiments to have a festival, to have a type of take care of some type of infrastructure, to build some kind of entertaining venue, and the friction was so low that you could just let people do this without having to stand up a corporation and do all the traditional boring things. Yeah, I think that you could have thousands of little oddities that were taken care of by DAOs, and maybe the world would be enriched because it would allow people to do a lot more interesting things in the world than they otherwise are right now.
Yeah, and so some of what you're talking about is disposable DAOs. That is also kind of an odd notion, in the same way that Burning Man is ephemeral and it's technically disposed of, but I suppose the spirit lives on in the participants for that year. Yeah. And if DAOs are also similarly disposable, I can imagine that future looking very incomprehensible to me today, because I certainly do not keep up with a lot of the TikTok trends or whatever it is, whatever inside joke, right? Like, yeah. I rely on other people to tell me about this stuff, and I subscribe to, I'm outing myself now, I guess, Out of the Loop, the subreddit Out of the Loop, where people just ask like, what the hell's going on with this? And then you get a summary. And even that, I imagine, is relatively late. And so I can see meme DAOs or like very special interest or things that are ephemeral DAOs where people are multiple members of things, and that being a lot of inside jokes that I don't understand. And so therefore I would not hear about to join. And so it in that way, it's kind of like, in the same way that people probably 100, 200 years ago would find the internet a little bit incomprehensible because all this stuff is happening, but like it's not real, right? And so like people's minds and attitudes have changed seemingly without talking to each other or getting next to each other, right? And so that's a little bit of a strange effect for people 200 years ago. And so I think similarly, we'll probably see that sort of illegibility in these DAOs, especially if they're so easily brought up and down.
Yeah, that's true. Right now, if you want to look up organization. They're fairly stable and they have a large presence somewhere. So you can find companies on LinkedIn. You can, hear about nonprofit organizations through various volunteer directories or whatever donation directories. But yeah, if you have these DAOs, I actually saw a really interesting kind of ephemeral DAO where somebody was running a reality show that was based on sailing around the world.
Wow.
And so if you own an NFT, you can be part of this DAO and you get to tell the boat where its next destination is, and have these reality people somewhere. And so you get a chance to influence this. And I can't imagine that DAO is going to last for years and years. That's a kind of you spin it up, you have a laugh at this reality show. It's going to last a few episodes, and then you're going to spin it down. And so there's probably going to be some kind of discovery mechanism, some kind of TikTok or Twitter-ish way to find out what's going on, what kind of DAOs are going on, and then get involved, and then those things will last as long as memes and hot takes last today.
Yeah, and I guess another even though the DAOs are ephemeral, the public ledger is forever. So you can actually see a history of these things popping in and out of existence too, if you can analyze the entire history of the public ledger. And so I wonder what sort of, if that information is valuable. I guess you can see what sort of DAOs have worked and what sort of DAOs happen. And so if you want to build that Dyson sphere or the loop-de-loop, you can take lessons from that. But maybe it's the same with when people figured out that the internet can make things go viral. They're just we can't replicate this. Maybe until BuzzFeed came along, and they were just I know, it's listicles, right? So.
Yeah.
So maybe it's something like that.
I think the public ledger is interesting. I've always been really fascinated with historical documentaries. And if you listen to these historical documentaries or watch them, a lot of their content and the basis by which they know how things were back then were because people used to write letters. They would write "Dear John, my neighbor recently got the first washing machine or the first radio I had ever seen in my town," and that's how we know that.
Dear John, I hope this letter finds you well.
Yeah, exactly.
I spent a fortnight on a horse. Yeah, whatever people say. I wish I was much better at impersonating them, but go on.
It's pretty good. Yeah. And so this is how we know what life was like on the frontier, and how some frontier town was run and whatnot. And I think there's obviously a lot of content now where we're documenting our lives ever increasingly, but it's in these walled gardens. It's in property, or not property of, but at least in the custody of these large corporations, and
which could go away, and if they get either acquired or something else happens, so they have no qualms about just throwing out the hard drives and erasing things. And then there's this mad scramble. I mean, GeoCities is a company that hosted web pages for people in the early 90s or so, and so when they were acquired by Yahoo kind of kept them around for a while, but eventually they weren't strategic around enough, and so they're just F it, we're just gonna get rid of it. You have a week or two to download your stuff if you care, right? And then there was this mad scramble to archive, but then they just they just erased those drives. So, I mean, as big as a corporation is today, that's no guarantee that they'll keep that stuff around tomorrow.
Yeah, and I think when it, maybe it's okay that it's not okay, but we can deal with the loss of, some small, hobbyist sites, but collectively, I don't know if that's, I mean, it's, that's a pretty big loss. And so, as I think about these DAOs, it's interesting that even these small throwaway DAOs can live on forever in the blockchain. They have the permanent record because we'll be able to see, also going deep into the future, if you're a kind of long-term thinker, we'll have this record of what were all the efforts that were tried, what were the interests that people were working towards, and those will be sort of memorialized in the blockchain.
Yeah, actually, there is. Is there a field called digital archaeology nowadays, or not, or are most
so.
archaeologists like deal with pottery and stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I think those people are like, think about the Wall Street bets. I'm sure that there are people who are archivists and things who are going to have to make note of, oh, there was this subreddit, there was a thing called Reddit, and there was this group within Reddit who was interested in market manipulation, and they had this effect on the stock. But like, all of that has to be documented. Whereas if Wall Street Bets was a DAO, you can see right there, like, oh, they amassed all this money and then they voted to buy a bunch of GameStop stock, and hundreds of years from now, I don't know if anybody will be interested in that, but if they were, they could go and inspect this thing and see what people did about that.
I'm sure there will be. I mean, there's this guy, CGP Gray or whatever his face is on YouTube. He did a whole episode on the origins of the name Tiffany, and leads you down this rabbit hole. Yeah. So yes, if that guy exists today, there will be some like digital archaeologists in the future, and blockchain history, or whatever history we record on blockchain, will probably be interest to them. So yeah, so I guess we've talked about a lot of things that, I mean, in doing the research for this, I didn't think of some of these things, but I guess that's why we talk to each other, where some of these things just seem like it's a really weird world, for the lack of a better word for it. And I do wonder whether we'll survive it, or we'll be like those people that just say, I just don't want to deal with this, and you young whippersnappers do whatever. So
yeah, I think that the world is going to become increasingly chaotic, and that kind of chaos is going to provide the energy that we need to kind of break out of sort of the great stagnation, as we say. And then maybe DAOs are going to allow us to actually move the world forward in a meaningful way, rather than having meaningless.
Right. I mean, there could be plenty of that, right? So,
yeah.
But yeah.
No. I think we should have both meaningless and meaningful DAOs, and not constrain them. But I think overall, being able to give groups of people the power to make an actual tangible influence on the world, whether the digital world or the physical world, is, I think, a good thing.
Yeah. I hope there would be a balance of chaos and stability, because like, if you don't have some of the underlying stability, it's hard to do commerce without like a politically stable state with like laws and jurisdictions, right? And so I'm not saying that I would hope that DAOs don't do away with the infrastructure that we currently do have, but what I do hope is that it'll allow people to do collective action on things that traditionally have been underserved by our governments, or like NGOs, or nonprofits, or even just like people that want to vote on naming a boat Bodie McBoatface or whatever, right? And so I mean, gives a little bit more color to the world. And so for things like that, like, I'm all for it. But yeah, like I think as with most things that we talk about on this show, when we extrapolate out, I'm both excited and apprehensive about the world to come. And so I would say, yeah, it's probably a sign of interesting times. And it's hard to see that in the large when you live it day to day, because it might not change day to day that much. But in fact, like, things have changed so much in the last 20 years, right? So
yeah, and the crazy thing about DAOs is that they're changing week to week, day to day almost. The activity in the space is super hot, and I'm really, really, really looking forward to the first court case where a DAO is sued in a U.S. court for some type of shenanigans, and I think that'll be a very interesting time for case law. I think there will be a lot of lulls to be had, and hopefully we'll see how we can strike the balance between mimetic chaos of the online world and the stability of the institutions we rely on.
Yeah. So with that, how's your optimism?
It is through the roof. I think let's build a Dyson sphere right now. I'm going to start a Dyson DAO.
All right. And so this is for Sri, this is Will.
And this is Sri.
And we are going to talk about more interesting and cool edges of technology next week. So don't miss out. Join us and subscribe, like, and smash that like, subscribe button or whatever it is. Bam, bam, bam. And we'll talk to you next week. All right. Take care. Bye.